So that big red nuclear button on the dashboard that you see, go ahead and hit that, President Trump. Country will be fine. Do it. This is the Life Giving Podcast. I'm your host, Isaac Lopez. So, welcome to the show. Glad to have you with me on your Friday morning, and on my Friday morning here. I have to admit that we did see some growth on the YouTube channel yesterday, on our last show rather, and I think it was because I was suffering. I don't know if that was because I was sweating profusely or if it was too warm, but for some reason you guys seemed to take pity on me. So here's another stab at that kind of rhetoric. It's very early in the morning. I do a lot for you guys. Help me out. Subscribe. Anyway, that's why I'm wearing my glasses. I don't feel like wearing contacts at it is now 5:40. So good to be with you guys. I honestly really enjoy these shows. So if you guys want to join in on the conversation, and it's not just a one-way street, join the Life Given Podcast Conversation Facebook group. That will be linked in the show notes. We've already started having conversations there, and it just helps put some context to who I'm talking to, and would probably be helpful for you guys as well to have some community around this podcast. And also today we are going to do something a little bit more fast-paced. I want to see how fast we can go through this show, and just see how condensed we can get down for you guys. And we'll finish off with a FreeThought Friday. But today, let's talk about lockdowns and how really they should have been the nuclear option. Now, before we begin, I think that a form of lockdown in the very beginning would have been much better than what we've experienced the last 4 or 5 months. And even if you go back and listen to former episodes where we were first entering lockdowns with this podcast, I feel like it was very providential of God that I started this podcast in January, because really it's been very hard to find something not to talk about. I think I said that right. I'll have to check that in post-production. That may not make it in. Anyway, so lockdowns. I was, like, okay, this could be the right option back at the beginning of this. But we're starting to see more and more scientists coming out and saying, hey, lockdowns probably weren't the best idea. We're starting to see more articles written. We're starting to see more balanced thinking well after we needed that thinking. So, I mean, we'll need it moving forward because of the second wave of lockdowns that will probably be coming down the pike. And primarily, it will be centered around this interview that they had with this that healthcare blog entertained with John Ioannidis. And this was back on July 9th, and he came out and was talking about giving some more context to his comments he made way back in March. He did an editorial for a paper that talked about how lockdowns really, we should have either seen them earlier or not at all, and how little their effect has been. And he has been ostracized since, but more people are starting to see that way. So actually, like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, said that I can't abandon that tool, being lockdowns, any more than I would abandon a nuclear deterrent. But it is like a nuclear deterrent. I certainly don't want to use it, and nor do I think we will be in that position again. What lockdowns do is completely shut down the system. Like if you're thinking of, say, take a human body as the system, you basically just cut off the blood flow, right? You're basically putting a slower, like a chokehold, so that it doesn't die right away. But instead, what you're doing is slowly choking it out. And this isn't like an actual chokehold, because those can put you out in a few seconds. This is someone who's trying to choke you out with very little experience, and they're not doing a great job of it, but you can't react. So it's just a slow, painful death all the way to the end. And that's kind of what they're doing to the economy and also to the schools and to every single infrastructure in the US except for journalism, which we should be getting rid of anyway. More on that later. But there are other people, such as Buck Sexton, who says that there are scenarios in which new information comes along here that shows us that this was a one-size-fits-all approach that was not the right move. And I said this from the beginning. There's a lack of nuance when we approach this shutting down of all the economy. I think we would have been better to protect the more targeted population, say 70 and above, because that's comprised, I think, like 80% of the deaths or something like that. I don't know if that's nationally or globally, but they have been the biggest targets for this virus. There was this one study that came out on Live Science that said that the authors of the study looked at 16 different studies, but they found only one study that looked at the effect of school closures. Now, mark this, we're going to be doing an in-depth show on school closings in the near future. But I'm saving that as a treat for a special reason, and we'll get to that. But there was this, but we will mention it now because more people are starting to talk about, well, should schools be closed? I think it would be great, but not in the way that a lot of people would think. The authors found, this is coming back to the study, only one study that looked at the effect of school closures separate from other social distancing measures. This study, which modeled the effect in the UK population, suggested that school closures by themselves were predicted to reduce COVID-19 deaths by only 2% to 4%, which was much lower than the effect of other measures, such as isolating infected cases. So, coming to this interview with John Ioannidis, he is one of the esteemed or initially esteemed epidemiologist at Stanford University. He had been ostracized for a long time. And he was in this interview that was transcribed in this blog post, and man, it is really, really good stuff, because we'll touch on a few answers to a few of the questions here, but I will link to it. You should go and read it because the majority of my listeners probably don't agree with going back into lockdowns. And if you do, he gives some good arguments for why we shouldn't. Okay. So this one, just to kind of set the table, there are going to be a lot of questions raised on whether or not on the decision that we made to go into lockdown, because there are arguments saying that we wish we had better data, but we did the best we could with the data that we had. And John responded and saying, that wasn't my position, though I can see why people thought I was advocating inaction when I was actually begging for better data to inform our actions. The two, decisions and knowledge, aren't mutually exclusive. We can design policy on imperfect information, yet keep gathering evidence so that our approach is fine-tuned. A decision such as an economic lockdown should be assumed provisional, awaiting more research and better information. Of course, we can't know everything there is to know about a novel virus in the beginning. Inaction is a false choice. What we're choosing between is an immutable decision and a decision updated by emerging evidence, rather than between inaction and gathering evidence. That just sounds like sound thinking, right? But people did not understand that that's what he had been pushing for initially. And I thought that's just a wonderfully summarized approach to this entire situation. And there was no option for nuance. There is no option given. There was like if you had a survey that you had to fill out and there were fixed answers, it was either I'm all for lockdowns or I'm a science denier. There's no middle ground. And when there's no middle ground on something like that, it can quickly become politicized, just like what we've seen with masks. So the interview goes on, and the reporter, the interviewer, says, "So you're not against locking down the economy?" The epidemiologist from Stanford responds, "By February, we missed the window for nipping the novel coronavirus in the bud. Had we acted earlier with aggressive testing, tracing, and isolating, like the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, and the Singaporeans did, the virus wouldn't have spread as wildly as it did. The biggest lesson from this pandemic is that the cost of delaying controlling the infection can be substantial. Act decisively in haste or repent at leisure." Amen. Once we missed the boat, that was my amen. Back to the quote. Once we missed the boat, the lockdown was inevitable. I say inevitable begrudgingly because I don't think it should have been reached that eventuality. It should have reached that eventuality. And here in closing, the situation, this is the interviewer, the situation would certainly have been different had the extent of the spread been identified in January, in the infection was controlled. If I understand you correctly, given our situation in March, as avoidable as it could have been in our state of knowledge at that time, you supported the lockdown. His response, "That's correct. Once the country was locked down, I felt we should be focusing in minimizing its duration. I view lockdown as a drug with dangerous side effects when its use is prolonged. It's an extreme measure, a last resort, the nuclear option. A country should be locked down not a minute longer than absolutely necessary. We have to keep assessing its risk-benefit calculus. By collecting and analyzing data, making sure we're measuring the denominator accurately and finding vulnerable and not vulnerable subgroups." Which I think is a great point, because when we looked at the coronavirus, when we're looking at how should we react to it, we kind of just think that the coronavirus is the only thing that causes death in the US. He goes on to later point out that there are just more social and economic damage and deaths that we are not accounting for when we are analyzing this lockdown. And he also goes on to mention how we shouldn't completely, even though it's a novel coronavirus, that doesn't mean we throw out all the laws of epidemiology out the window, because he had compared it to the seasonal flu, and percentage, case fatality rate, it's very similar. And yet he got absolutely blown up for basically he got absolutely blown up for that kind of statement way back when. And yet, we've seen guys like him get blown up in the past making similar statements, but we're seeing now that he was right, that they were right. And it's due to the fact that a lot of these coronavirus, novel or not, a lot of the bugs that we've seen share a lot of similarities, and that's why there are certain laws in epidemiology. So I would read the interview. I think it provides some great context and some great wisdom on the lockdowns itself. I hope that what my breakdown there helped, just to kind of get the brain waves moving a little bit, just add a little friction to your thinking. And maybe lockdowns should have been considered more nuclear than a last resort than what we initially expected, or thought of them as. Like, if just for 2 weeks, the economy could have bounced back, but we're 120 plus days into this thing. Let's not kid ourselves. There's hell to pay for it. And I think we've got to do a lot better job in the future, holding our leadership accountable for the decisions that they've made and continue to make through this lockdown. All right, so to wrap things up, let's talk about our FreeThought Friday. At the beginning of the show, I said, hey, let's try to keep it short today. I can tell that's not happening, so I will try to keep this segment short. And this is the segment where we discuss things that help put current events into context, right? Ruth and I, my wife, we just were at a friend's house last night and had dinner with multiple good friends of ours, and it was great. It was great to reconnect. Uh, One of the things that stood out to me with my conversation with a few of my friends was just how little time they seem to have for current events. Right? Um, there's just a lot that goes on in life, and that's understandable, and that's why there's this show and the life-given news that is starting to ramp up. We'll keep the self-plugging to that comment right there, but that raises a good question. How much time are you setting aside for current events? When it comes to issues that are going on in today, do you feel convicted that you need to be more in tune with what's going on in the world? And how are you taking steps to arm yourself with more information? And how are you turning that into wisdom and knowledge? Is it listening to podcasts? Is it reading articles? But whatever it is, I would encourage that you set half an hour of your week out of your week to just do some perusing. Because you just do maybe 10 minutes a day or something like that, and you will be surprised at how much you can glean in that time, because there are so many resources out there that really it just takes the time to sign up for a newsletter or the time to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Dang, I did it again. I'll try to keep it down. How are you setting time aside? Right? How are you setting time aside to make time for current events, which is such an important topic? And just set small chunks of time aside, and you'll be surprised at how much you will know at the end of 1 week, at the end of 2 weeks, even on a tight schedule. 5 minutes a day can really keep the monsters at bay. All right. So remember that the life that you have been given and the life that you have received includes every area of life. Current events are no exception. God bless.